afternoon, wherever you might be. My name is Barry Nixon, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. And I am the publisher of the Background Buzz, which is the leading e-magazine for the background screening industry. And we also publish several other publications for the industry. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. Chrissy Booker, Director of Marketing Programs for Appriss Insights, which administers the nation's most comprehensive source of person-based incarceration, justice, and risk intelligence data. Les Rosen, Founder, CEO of ESR Check, which was recently rated as the #1 background screening service provider by HRO Today. Rachel Tyson, COO, in Check, a leading background screening provider that provides customized pre-employment and volunteer background checks. Our topic today is a very topical one because recently in the United States, we've had a number of protests focused on social justice and equality. At the core of our topic today is how can background screening companies be more proactive and address the issues of bias built into criminal justice system data, which is a primary source of data for criminal records. Both the Professional Background Screening Association and SHRM have reported that over 96% of US companies conduct criminal record checks as part of their hiring process, and it can be instrumental in them making a hiring decision. Many people believe that criminal justice system data is highly accurate and simply reports the facts as they are. This is far from the truth. There is an overwhelming evidence that a great deal of the criminal record justice system data is tainted because it starts with a person when they are engaged by law enforcement. People of color are arrested at a rate considerably higher than their white counterparts. And this is well documented. And it is extremely difficult to cleanse this information from the myriad and hodgepodge of records that too often find their ways into reports given to employers. The same issues exist for conviction records. And even when a record is expunged by the court, getting that information completely out of all the various record files and databases is a Herculean task. This leaves CRAs who gather and report the data and HR professionals in a very troubling position. Our vision for our discussion today is to increase your understanding of this troubling issue and to explore some strategies that can help to address this situation. And with that, I'd like to introduce Chrissy Booker, who will talk about the data side of the equation of criminal records.
Thanks, Barry. Thank you for your gracious introduction to our panel discussion today. I've been looking forward to this presentation for many weeks now, as it's a topic that's very personally important to me. As you mentioned, I lead marketing at Appriss Insights, and Appriss Insights is a leading wholesale data provider to consumer reporting agencies, or CRAs. We are a data analytics company focused on providing data and solutions to make our communities and our workplaces safer. As a data provider, Appriss is just one player in the background screening ecosystem. So what goes into a background check? The average background check will include identity verification, a credit report, education and employment history, and criminal records. A check of criminal records is one of the most fundamental components of a background check. Criminal record data may include arrests, warrants, convictions, sex offender registry data, traffic violations, felonies, misdemeanors, inmate records, probation and parole records, and even penalties and fines. National criminal records are an output of the U.S. criminal justice system, a system that has unfortunately been overly punitive to underserved populations, in particular Black men. Today, I'm going to share with you some statistics that paint a picture of a justice system which unfairly punishes underprivileged populations. Bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, so you should be seeing a chart. This is international rates of incarceration per 100,000 people. So 40 years ago, the number of people incarcerated in the US was about 500,000, but by 2008, it had quadrupled to 2.3 million. The US now has the highest prison and jail population and incarceration rate of any country in the world. We represent 5% of the world's population, but house 25% of the world's prisoners. As a result of our push towards mass incarceration, today, 1 in 4 Americans has a criminal record. Many of those records are for arrests that did not lead to convictions or are for nonviolent offenses such as drug possession. As the result of racial profiling and discriminatory policies, people of color, especially Black males, are far more likely to have arrest and conviction records than whites. Blacks make up 13% of the population, but they account for 28% of all arrests and 40% of incarcerations. Blacks are not only more likely to be arrested, they are more likely to be convicted of crimes. Black males are incarcerated at almost 6 times the rate of white males. In order to understand how the system became so racially biased, we need to look back at history. One key factor that led to mass incarceration in the US is the war on drugs. The war on drugs was a government-led initiative that began in the 1970s and is still evolving today. It aimed to stop illegal drug use and distribution by dramatically increasing prison sentences for drug dealers and users. Black men, in particular, have been victims of the wars on drug and crime. Although rates of drug use and selling are comparable across racial and ethnic groups, Blacks and Latinos are far more likely to be criminalized for drug law violations than whites. 57% of those incarcerated in prison for drug offenses are either Black or Latino, and approximately 20% of inmates are locked up for a drug offense. American views on drugs across political lines are evolving. In last week's election, voters rejected a punitive and ineffective system for dealing with substance abuse and addiction. Arizona, Mississippi, Montana, Oregon, and South Dakota voted to relax their drug laws. Wherever cannabis legalization or drug decriminalization was on the ballot, people voted in favor of it. Incarceration for drug offenses should be replaced with a network of drug treatment and recovery services. Locking up drug addicts does not solve the root problem. Government policies on drugs and crime have also led to high recidivism rates. 1 in 4 people who go to jail will be arrested again within the same year. And these individuals often suffer from poverty, mental illness, and substance use disorders. These problems only worsen with incarceration. Re-entering society after life in prison is extremely difficult. Former inmates are faced with mental health issues due to incarceration, lack of housing, and lack of employment after they are released. The life they knew before prison no longer exists, and having a criminal record is like having a modern-day scarlet letter you display with every potential job opportunity. Formerly incarcerated people are unemployed at a rate of about 27%. This is well above the US unemployment rate at any point in history, even the Great Depression. The perpetual stigma of incarceration creates a counterproductive system of release and poverty, hurting the formerly incarcerated, employers, taxpayers, and society as a whole. The human and financial costs are staggering. Mass incarceration is estimated to cost the US over $180 billion a year. So what can we do as professionals in the HR, talent acquisition, and background screening industries to help former inmates become contributing members of society and help end the cycle of recidivism and poverty? Les Rosen, CEO of Employment Screening Resources, is here today to share some guidance with us, specifically around EEOC, Ban the Box, and Fair Chance hiring. Hi, Les.
Hi, Chrissy. Thank you very much. This is a topic that's been near and dear to me. I've spent most of my adult life behind bars. Well, but as a lawyer, I was able to leave at the end of the day. And so this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, given the number of criminal defendants and I have worked with over the years. So as a result of the type of statistics that Chrissy just mentioned, many elected officials and second chance advocates have realized the best way to break the cycle of recidivism, and recidivism means the tendency to reoffend, was for people to have a job. Without a job, you can never be a tax-paying, law-abiding citizen. And otherwise, if we don't give people jobs as a society, we're going to end up paying more taxpayer dollars on prisons and jails than schools and hospitals, and that's ridiculous. So not only is employment the most effective tool to break the cycle of recidivism, but it also turns out that ex-offenders are an overlooked pool of labor. And from studies, we know scientifically that as a group, ex-offenders tend to be very hardworking, very loyal, and a group with low turnover. So the first efforts in order to give ex-offenders an opportunity for employment was called Ban the Box. And the box refers to that part of a typical employment application where at some point, either on paper or online, a person was asked at the very beginning of the process, before they were even out the gate, if they had a criminal record, and there would be a box to check yes or no. And the idea behind Ban the Box was that having a criminal record on the initial application could cause an employer to assume that the risk was too high, and the criminal record effectively became use a term from recruiting, an early knockout punch, where the application was disregarded before the person even had the chance to show what they can do as an individual or as a person. They were just judged by the record. Also, ex-offenders would be chilled or deterred from applying in the first place because they knew they either had to tell the truth, which meant they probably would be risk rejection immediately, or lie. So the idea behind Ban the Box was intended to give ex-offenders a chance to show what they could contribute as an individual and to be evaluated on their merits without first being prejudged as an undesirable applicant based upon their status. And after all, the root of the word prejudice is to prejudge someone, meaning you're judging someone on some status as opposed to who they are as an individual. And the idea was that a relevant background check could be run later in the process after an applicant with a criminal record could initially complete on the even playing field. And there's now over 150 states, counties, local jurisdictions that have some sort of ban the box laws, with more laws being passed all the time and more employers adopting the same policy. Worth noting that this idea of ban the box has now morphed into a more comprehensive laws called fair chance hiring laws that go beyond the initial application process and impact the entire hiring process, such things as which criminal records can be considered, when a background check could be run, oftentimes post-offer, what type of notices a candidate received, what other protections and procedures are involved. And one of the most critical parts that we all need to understand of fair chance hiring laws is this critical concept of an individualized assessment. And that was a key part of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, the federal unit in the United States, federal government agency that oversees enforcement of Title VII discrimination laws on the use of criminal records in their 2012 updated criminal guidance, which we all need to be familiar with. And the EEOC made it clear that, number one, and most importantly, that the use of criminal records to automatically reject someone from employment can be a form of discrimination based upon disparate impact. Chrissy gave you the statistics. Disparate impact means that a criminal record may seem neutral on its face, but in the real world, mathematically results in certain groups being systematically or systemically denied employment opportunities. So when there is a criminal record, assuming the criminal record is accurate, and there's proper identifiers, the EEOC guidance first recommends that, number one, employers ban the box. There's numerous state, local laws that require that as well. Secondly, you should only ask about a criminal record at or after the interview. Some states require it to be post-offer. And third, if there is a criminal record, employers should not react to it automatically, an employer has to go through what's called a targeted screen, a three-part screen where they need to evaluate risk. What's the nature and gravity of the crime? What's the nature of the job? How old is the crime? Because the older the crime, the less relevant it would be. And that type of calculus will tell you whether there's risk involved. And I should mention the EEOC also cautioned that an arrest is not a conviction and should be handled carefully. And in fact, many states prohibit the consideration of something that is just an arrest and where a conviction never occurred, because an arrest is just a police officer's opinion. And finally, in the end, if the employer decides not to hire someone based upon a criminal record, the final act and the process that we all need to make sure that we are doing now is to provide an individualized assessment. And that means before denying a job opportunity due to a criminal record, the applicant is given the opportunity to talk to you either about the facts of the crime or about themselves, and to give you information that would bear upon the job so that they are being evaluated as an individual as opposed to a person with a criminal record. So I would strongly suggest that you make sure you're working with your screening firm or your HR advisor, your corporate counsel, to ensure you're in compliance with a very complicated set of rules that really limit the use of criminal records. And with that, let me turn it over to Rachel. And Rachel, what's been your personal experience with racial injustice, and how did your experience motivate you to take action?
Thank you, Les. As Barry mentioned, our vision for today's discussion is to increase understanding of the bias built into criminal justice data and explore strategies to help address racial injustice. Chrissy and Les did a great job of highlighting this bias, and my initial step to exploring strategies was to address racial injustice by reflecting on my own experience. To be quite honest, I've very recently gone from considering myself an innocent bystander to recognizing the role I play in racial injustice. I was raised by self-described hippies who taught me to be open to different perspectives and backgrounds. I was taught to be curious, to celebrate difference, to be empathetic, and to respect others. My paternal grandfather, described by my oldest brother as a 1940s closet feminist, volunteered to teach English as a second language to immigrants, and was an active member of an interfaith group that was dedicated to promoting understanding and fellowship among Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Born in 1915, his unique and progressive views had a profound impact on me. I was aware of the disparities in arrest and incarceration data. I was also raised not to view this data as a reflection of the innate criminality of people of color, but instead as a reflection of the racial injustice in the US. I acknowledged the existence of systemic racism, and I felt empathy towards marginalized communities. With this awareness came the thought that I played no part in the racial injustice I knew existed. And then came the death of George Floyd and many others in the middle of a global pandemic. That's when I realized my silence and inaction only served to further racial injustice. And that's when I was motivated to action. I realized that the injustice that I knew existed was not a result of individual intentions or actions or individual views of supremacy, but rather an overarching political, economic, and social system of white dominance. I recognized that I benefited from this system, as have my parents, grandparents, and so many before me. With that painful revelation, I began to seek understanding, identifying ways in which I can use my privilege for change. I learned a lot of important lessons in this time of self-reflection, lessons that I imagine will be ever evolving in this lifelong journey. And I want to share just 3 of those lessons today. The first is, I am not a bad person. Being white does not make me a bad person. Conversations around race must shift away from good versus bad. To be open to difficult conversations on race, I cannot maintain the simplistic view that racism is an intentional act of discrimination committed only by bad people. As employers, HR professionals, and industry leaders, it's imperative that we be open to difficult conversations as we work to dismantle barriers in our recruiting, screening, and retention practices, or what I'll refer to as hiring practices moving forward. The second lesson is my opinions are not well informed. Like most people, I have strong opinions about racism. However, I must understand that I am not an expert. Racism is a complex social structure of which I have not devoted myself to intentional and ongoing study. As a leader, I must make the effort to better educate and inform myself on this topic. As employers, HR professionals, and industry leaders, this is where we can focus on broadening our understanding of the bias built into criminal justice data and identifying opportunities to mitigate bias in our hiring practices. And the final lesson I want to share is this isn't about me. I recently had a discussion with a colleague regarding the challenges we're facing as a society. She shared her personal experience as a Black woman, stating that the recent events have caused her mom to do a lot of self-reflection. As a white woman, her mom realized that although she raised a mixed daughter, she still harbors prejudice. I think this demonstrates how deep-rooted and ingrained bias can be. Regardless of my life experiences, regardless of what I think about myself as a good person, regardless of the personal and professional relationships I have forged with people of color, this isn't about me. To quote Robin DiAngelo's definition of racism, this is about a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. Racism is a structure, not an event. But this doesn't mean that I don't have a role to play. As employers, HR professionals, and industry leaders, we have a profound opportunity to break down barriers. Again, by understanding the bias in criminal justice data, we can reevaluate our hiring practices, specifically our screening policies, in order to reduce barriers to employment. Thinking about the role I must play in the dismantling of racial injustice led me to reflect on women's suffrage, appropriate given that 2020 was a presidential election year and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Women, specifically white women, were granted the right to vote because men supported their cause. In turn, the fight for racial justice cannot be achieved by the efforts of people of color alone. This does not mean that people of color need a white savior, but rather white allies to fight alongside them. I've begun to take the steps to understand how I can be a more inclusive leader and drive InCheck in a direction of more inclusive hiring practices. With the help of thought leaders and industry experts, such as Barry Nixon and my fellow panelists, I've also begun to explore how CRAs can help employers mitigate screening bias for underserved populations, specifically bias against people of color. As Les mentioned, employment is the most effective tool to break the cycle of recidivism. Reviewing your screening policies is a good place to start. Employers should consider removing criminal history questions from their application, even when not legally obligated to do so. I recommend creating position-specific screening protocol and decision matrices to limit what records you review and how far back you screen. By working with a screening partner, you can ensure you only see records that matter for the role for which you are hiring. Depending on your industry regulations, consider excluding arrest records and dismiss cases from your screening process entirely. In addition to having well-documented screening protocols, decision matrices, and adverse action and dispute policies, follow EEOC guidance for an individualized assessment when examining the applicant's criminal history. In addition to considering the nature and gravity of the crime and the nature of the job and age of offense, I've seen employers use the individualized assessment as an opportunity for applicants to share additional information about themselves and their past circumstances, and to provide character references. These assessments go beyond the criminal act, allowing employers to better understand the individual. It's important to note that CRAs are employers too. And with an understanding of criminal justice data, we have an obligation to review our own hiring practices and identify ways to mitigate our own screening bias. We also have an obligation to educate our clients on FCRA, ban the box, fair chance hiring, adverse action, individualized assessments, the list goes on. We must support our clients in their goals to mitigate screening bias. We also have an obligation to take it a step further by educating our clients on arrest and incarceration data. More than 650,000 people are released from prison each year. Without a steady job, ex-offenders are likely to recidivate. Even people who have never been incarcerated are often denied jobs because of their criminal background. By recognizing the disparities in criminal justice data, employers can make more informed decisions regarding their hiring practices, specifically their screening policies, in order to help mitigate bias and reduce barriers to employment.
Thank you, Rachel, for sharing your personal experience and your journey. And thank you, Chrissy and Les. Our panelists did an excellent job in really sharing their expertise and views. And I'd like our audience to keep in mind that you have an opportunity to make a difference, not only in helping underserved populations get a fair chance at employment, which is critical to their well-being, but also to making them contributors to society. And you also can contribute to your organization's diversity and inclusion efforts which overall will improve our economy if people have jobs, and also our communities. And this is a prime opportunity for CRAs, employers, the HR community, as well as technology providers to partner to drive positive social change in our country, which hopefully will lead to a vast improvement in social justice and equality for all. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I encourage you to join us in the speaker lounge with any questions that you have, and we will be happy to engage with you. So thank you very much.